My name's Andy Davis, and I run Trident Manor, which is a security risk and crisis management consultancy. We're based here in Darlington, but we do operate around the world. When COVID started, many people were somewhat blindsided. Interestingly, in December last year, we were tasked by a Silicon Valley company to start analysing what was happening in Wuhan because they had a factory. So to some extent, we actually had a bit of foresight as what was happening, how it was happening, the spread. But one of the things that actually remains throughout is the fact that, organisations should be able to identify the risks that can impact them, their organisations, look at it proactively, analyse it, and then actually take steps to manage and reduce the risks, which in return result in greater effectiveness of operations. So today, what I'd like to talk about is organisational risk and resilience in a COVID era. And really that is helping people understand, yes, it's happened. Yes, we're still there, but there's things that we can actually do proactively to help reduce the risks, which by default will then increase organisation resilience. What I'm going to do is just talk really in four sub-paragraphs, four subparts. And these are: one, discussing the global impact of COVID; two, understanding organisational threats and the risks that they pose; three, talk about enabling organisational resilience; and four is establishing a continuous review process, because as things are, risks aren't static. COVID isn't static. It's changing, it's evolving as are our measures to try and tackle it. So what I'd like us to do is just start talking about the global impact of COVID on the pandemic. So the first thing to identify is it's very rare that the World Health Organization declares a pandemic. I must admit, for December, January, I said, we're in a pandemic. World Health Organization will never declare a pandemic. Lo and behold, they declared a pandemic. And that shows the severity of it, because the World Health Organization does not like using that term. So with the onset and the recognition of a pandemic, certain actions happen around the world. Organized countries, organizations try to club together to tackle. That is still ongoing since February. One thing to say is that the pandemic doesn't discriminate. It doesn't discriminate against individuals. You can be a child and get it, although the risks are lower. You can be elderly and be at higher risk. But also, we look at organizations are impacted, governments are impacted, nations are impacted. So it doesn't discriminate. And from an organizational point of view, what we can do is we can do what is within our remit as individuals and as organizations, as owners of companies. And the rest, we will have to actually adapt to the situation as it happens. It has impacted severely in some cases, some notable casualties that have suffered because of the COVID. Cathay Pacific, it had to shut down 96% of its flights, lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. It had to actually close the budget airline that it had, which is the Hong Kong Express, and that was having daily commutes in and out of mainland China and Hong Kong. Carnival, the world's biggest cruise liner, $1 billion a month just to actually maintain its fleet. 32 million expected customers that it was going to have materialized in 2020. Bringing things a bit closer to home, Debenhams, it was already struggling as a retailer. It had to file for bankruptcy during April. It's not just Debenhams. We've seen Monsoon, Oasis, TM Lewin, Oak Furnitureland. All of these high street brands have been impacted, not necessarily directly as a result, but potentially as a consequence, because they may very well have been financially struggling. Shearing's Holidays, the specialist leisure group, collapsed in May. 2,500 job losses, 65,000 bookings lost. Obviously, the current in the current climate, and certainly very topical, Cineworld decision to close all of its UK outlets indefinitely. It will be interesting to see whether, from a mothball situation, they can recover. But the financial impact has affected them. Small businesses in the high street, and of course the hospitality sector. So these are all organisations that have been directly impacted by the COVID negatively. There have been other organisations that have actually been impacted positively. Zoom, I mean, Zoom shares in the last 6 months have skyrocketed. I wish I had my pension in them in December last year. Yeah, people are using technologies because they have to. And so as such, they've actually positively impacted. Chemical companies, the requirement for hand sanitisation, antibacterial wipes, chemical companies have benefited. They've been able to diversify. Pharmaceutical companies, they've benefited. The R&D programs are going into overdrive in the hope that they can be the first to find the cure. Online entertainment, Netflix subscriptions have actually directly impacted Cineworld. So lots more people in the safety of the home have actually taken online entertainment. Food producers benefited. Supermarket chains benefited, certainly the stockpiling at the start, but also the continued need. Linked to that is the logistics that support the supermarket chains, that continue to support. And so on that, I would look at the Aldi truck being very local. And of course, the logistics, which is we're eating a lot more food at home. So your guy from Just Eat, that really has benefited and impacted. And to a degree, local retailers, the corner shop has benefited more than many people expected from COVID, because people are staying local, so therefore they're using the local resources. So yes, there are winners and losers. What COVID has also done is it's caused people to adjust their business operations, in that there's a lot less travel, locally, nationally, and internationally. Certainly, I know as a fact, I've been directly impacted by not being able to go see clients in the Middle East. Obviously, the impact on travel isn't just isn't just flight. It also includes rail. It also includes coaches, which we've seen the casualties to a degree already. So it caused people to adjust how much travel they actually do. It has caused us to increase the use of technology, like we're doing now, even if it fails to a degree. But we're forced down the line to use technology. It's also caused us to look at contractual obligations. I know I've been impacted, and I know many of my colleagues have been impacted by force majeure. If we can't actually provide the services that we're contracted to deliver, then the contract becomes null and void. So it has caused adjustments to the contractual obligations and impacted through cancellations. It has caused market reappraisal. So it's caused organisations to think about how they're operating. Was their model sustainable in COVID, or actually should they look at new ways of operating to meet the needs, the desires, or creating a new strategy for ourselves? We've gone down the line of actually creating the Tribeman Training Academy, as well as the Tribeman Protective Services, which we didn't do before COVID. But as part of our strategic review, it caused us to adjust what we were doing to meet clients' needs. Reduced services. This shows an incident in Armenia in 2018, when there was the political uprising, peaceful uprising. At the current time, Armenia and Azerbaijan are at de facto war, which is bringing in Turkey and Russia. Clients have asked me to go there, but I can't give that. I can't provide them services. That's on an international basis. But if we look more local, more national or regional, those home hairdressing services, their ability to operate has been severely reduced. So it causes people to actually adjust how they're operating, the manner, whether there's any PPE needed, a whole range of things that cause a reduction in service. And some organisations have actually gone down the lines of hibernating. They don't see any benefit in continuing to trade at the present time. And so what they're going to do is not trade and then in 6 months reassess. It is an option. Cineworld are talking about that. Or is that just a way of them reducing the pain when they eventually do close down? But hibernation, some companies have actually gone down that line. One thing we can say about COVID and its impact is it's created an awful lot of uncertainty. And anybody who tells you that they know what's going to happen in the next 2, 3, 4, 6 months, yeah, I would love to see how accurate they will be. There is a great deal of uncertainty because we don't have a cure. There is political uncertainty going on in the world. Not only are we dealing with COVID, we're dealing with Brexit. So there's an awful lot of uncertainty that's happening, and it's been really, really highlighted because of COVID. I think another thing that it's going to be a continued consequence, certainly for the short, medium term. There's still going to be a lot of pain and an awful lot of confusion. People are uncertain in themselves. When we talk about pain, it's not just financial, it's also well-being, it's also the mental pain, the trauma, the stress that people are put under. But organisations are going to continue to suffer pain. Can they continue to pay the salaries? Are they able to actually meet the demands of clients, or is there that much turmoil ongoing that's questionable whether it's worthwhile continuing to keep operations going? But a flip side of that is potentially there are greater opportunities that are going to come because of this. The opportunities are through loss of competition. Opportunities can be because you've been proactive in your diversification and your approach to managing the COVID pandemic. So these are the sort of consequences I consider are going to continue and will be there certainly for the short, medium term. If we now pull it back to organisations and the risks, the threats and risks that we face, how can we manage them? How can we actually take it from where we are now positively into the future? I think the first thing that we have to do is you have to understand organisational threats and the risks that they pose. Before any organisation can implement proactive measures to reduce risks, you've got to understand what can cause that harm. First of all, you've got to understand where you are vulnerable to that source of harm, to that source of risk. And so what I want to do is just actually put the next section in such a way that it helps people understand what we actually mean by threats and what we mean by looking at the organisational process to help reduce the risks that exist. And the first thing is that we've got to understand what assets an organisation has. These can be tangible or intangible. So, for example, does the organisation have lots of cash reserves? Is there equipment that is vitally important that ensures the organisation to function? Are there production lines that mean that the product that you create is deliverable, is serviceable, is timely. These tangible items we can hold. It's something we can see, we can feel, we can touch. And so therefore, it has a value, not just the financial aspects of it, which many companies actually consider, but actually this is where we need to look more operational functionality wise. Then of course there's the intangible assets, trademarks, Coca-Cola, globally recognized trademark, intellectual property, confidential information. That is an intangible asset. Our operational practices are intangible assets. How you establish your policies, practice, procedures, how you get from point A to point B are intangible. Supply chains, your knowledge, reputation, creditworthiness, goodwill, all of these are intangible assets that as an organization, really you've got to understand what you have as an asset. And then really what you've got to understand is how important are them assets to your organization now and going forward into the future. Asset criticality, how critical are these assets to your organization? And what I always say to people is, flip charts are great, whiteboards are great. Put up there what assets you have. Now, an asset register is normally done by an accountant, and it includes tangible assets that have a cash value, as opposed to the intangible assets, and certainly when we look at operational practices. Equally, the operational practice might have a greater criticality than a tangible asset. So really, it's important that you actually identify and categorize the value to your organization of individual assets. I use a very simple, ancillary. If you lost them, as it says there, it doesn't really matter. You can replace them. Individual asset, important assets are those assets that, if lost or destroyed, wouldn't be critical, but actually could give you a degree of disruption, local emergencies. And then there are those critical assets which are so vital that if you lost them, it would severely impact the viability of the organization. Two things that are nearly always critical assets in nearly all organizations: people and information. And if you know these assets and you know what they have, yes, you can use an asset register. You can adapt those that are created by financial institutions. Certainly, I've worked with clients, and we've created a separate page for tangible, intangible assets, just so they understand, and it helps them identify what you need to protect. So if you understand your assets, then you've got to understand what can actually harm it. Well, what is a threat? And people confuse threats and risks, and they're two totally distinct things. So any factor, an action, circumstance, event, which has the potential to cause loss, harm, or damage to an individual, to an organization, to a nation, that is the threat source. And here we have pandemics, disease are threat sources. Equally, climate and environmental issues can be threat sources. Now, when they are not man-made, when they're not created through adversarial threats, i.e. a human interaction, normally would call them hazards. Threats and hazards, however you manage them, is the same, because they help you identify the level of risks that exist. So yes, we have crime, we have terrorism, we also have data loss and breaches. These are threats to organizations. So if you know what can harm you, then you could actually look and understand what are your vulnerabilities. What vulnerabilities does your organization have to the threat source? So for example, what vulnerability do we have in Darlington from the threat from terrorism? What does our building have from the threat from organised crime? Are there gaps in our defences? Because if you understand the threats and you can actually see, here's a potential gap, that means there's a risk. If there are risks, you can then take steps to actually manage them. And as an organisation, it's very, very prudent, especially as the way in which we operate is going to change. So here's a classic example. The world is going to continue to be vulnerable from COVID-19 until such time as we develop a vaccine. It's a fact. Equally, if you leave your front door of your home open, you are vulnerable to burglary. The level of risk might be different, but you're still vulnerable to it. I've mentioned risk a few times. What is risk? Well, if we take ISO 31000, it's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Obviously very business orientated, but in simplest terms, a risk is a combination of the likelihood of an event occurring and the consequences or the impact of it happening. Threats influence risk, not the other way around. Risks are very fluid in nature, and risks, for example, you can't say, okay, the risk against Darlington Council, this is the risk and it will stay the same for the next year. Circumstances, situations, all of these factors, social aspects, all influence the level of risk that exists. It's very fluid. But what organisations have to do is actually understand their own organisational tolerance levels. They have to understand what is acceptable, and they have to understand, within what parameters they are going to operate. For me, and certainly many of the organisations I've worked with, most important thing is actually having a risk management policy. By having the risk management policy, it clearly defines and works with organisations, helps the whole organisation understand the parameters in which they're working with. Once we identify the threats and any risks, so the risk being, is that likely to occur? What's the consequences of it? Simplest way for organisations, and many organisations do use matrices, you can give it a point score, and if we look at the probability of the occurrence, you would add 1 to 6. In this case, sometimes you use 1 to 5, sometimes you use 1 to 4, and then you identify, you put a descriptor against each, and then you can categorize the level of risk that exists. The higher the risk, especially if you have a high risk against a critical asset, the more you should seek to protect it. So if that's your people, how are you going to protect them? And especially if we look at the COVID scenario. If it scores very low risk, then actually do you need to invest the money, the time, or the effort in managing that risk, or do you deal with a great higher priority? Risk management systems are effective for all organisations. They do involve work. They do involve a degree of understanding. They certainly involve buy-in. But once an organisation has that buy-in and has that structure, it's then actually quite easy to manage and to continually progress and update your risk management activity. And the idea is, the more you can reduce the risk, the more you can manage the risk, the more operationally effective your organisation is going to be. If we understand then what the risks are, and certainly when we look at COVID, we can start understanding what can impact the organisation. We should be aware of what's happened in the past. However, what we always need to do is be looking forward in risk management, so we can actually prevent future events, and so that's being proactive as opposed to being reactive to past events. So really, what can sink your ship? What can sink your organisation going forward? We are in a crisis situation, and the crisis impacts different organisations at different levels in different ways. But when we are in this, we need to look at what internal and external factors can actually impact our organisation. And going forward, or looking at current and foreseeable threats, what we should be doing is looking across a range of services, activities that we undertake. So really, when we want to look at our current threats in this crisis situation, what services are we offering? What services are critical to our organisation, to our continued viability and our continued ability to function as an organisation? What location are we working from? Have we reverted back to the UK, or are we continuing to have international offices? Are we continuing to send staff overseas? How is the location overseas able to operate and to function? What staff do we have? What staff do we need? What are our supplies routes? Our supply routes in, our supply routes out. What are our access routes to market? How do we actually provide the services or deliverables to our clients who want and expect us to be in the Middle East? Or how do we take advantage of opportunities that are in the Far East? What are our organisational risk tolerance and acceptance levels? If we start asking these questions, then as an organisation, you're able to start identifying any potential threats to your organisation. It's all about prioritising. It's all about what do we need to do, and when do we need to do it? Somebody said to me, oh, we have a 5-year strategy. 5-year strategies are brilliant in times of normality. At a time of crisis, your strategy and your strategic approach has to shrink. You have to look shorter term, because there are so many uncertainties, as we mentioned earlier, about what is happening at the present time. So we have to identify these sort of threats, and then we've got to look at what are our primary threat considerations. If we look at staff, we have to consider COVID. We have to consider their health and well-being. Do we have enough PPE for them? Travelling to and from the office, is it appropriate? Is it safe? What about the international travel? Is it appropriate? Is it safe? Capabilities. As an organisation, are we capable of being able to work as we did before? This comes under operations, or we look at staff capabilities. I would say, well, okay, what do we need to give them so they can actually function? What volume of work are they proactively taking part in and delivering our services? Because if they're only effective for 40% of the time, as an owner, to keep an organisation viable, you've got to question what's the most effective way of utilising the staff. What threats are on the individual, but what threats do staff pose to the organisation? When we look at operations, we've got to consider the delivery of goods, our supply chains. We've got to look at our procedures. Do they remain relevant? Are they effective? Are they legal? Because certainly when we look at our staff, we have a duty of care. We have an increased duty of care, especially if we're asking them to travel to country A, B, or C. Okay. Is it legal? Are there insurance considerations? So there's all of these things where if we consider our operations, what are the primary threats that can impact our operations? Solvency, okay, it is a major issue. It's killed a number of companies. It's causing others severe pain. But what cash do we have in reserve? What threats are there to our income, to our outgoings? What about non-payments? How are we going to actually manage our debt recovery? Reputation. Some organisations, if you have a poor reputation, you might as well shut up. And that certainly comes in the professional areas. But has anything regarding COVID had a direct impact on the reputation of, or on your company's reputation, on your branding? What about your clients? Have they actually done things that have negatively impacted your reputation? There are a whole range of legal considerations, and that includes contractual, looking at duty of care, health and safety, ongoing insurance requirements, because they have been changing. So by considering the primary threat considerations, enables you then to call it future gazing. But if I do option A, what are the threats and what risks? If I seek new markets, how do I meet the legal and moral requirements? So by considering all of these factors, what you're doing by default is you're enabling organizational resilience. You are increasing your organization's robustness. At times of trouble, we still have little shoots of recovery. We would hope that the shoots of recovery were far stronger, far more robust. But how do we actually enable and encourage that recovery to proceed? And it sounds really boring, but actually looking at your organizational governance, helps you. What policies do you have in place? What practices and procedures? And they, in turn, will help you manage the risks. It will also potentially help reduce the risks that you potentially face through malpractice, legal obligations, etc. Organizational governance is really important, and obviously I would always advocate that risk management policy it should be really high up there in organizations' governance requirements. Operational practices. What operations do you have? Where do you have them? Are you able to function as you have done, or do you need to change and adapt? When we look at staffing levels, do we have the right number of staff? Actually, are some people surplus to requirements at the present time? Has it identified that some roles actually don't add value to the organisation and shouldn't stay? My own organisation, we've actually somehow identified that during this time we need to increase the number of people that we have. So I identified that we didn't have sufficient staff. We didn't have sufficient staff with the specific skills to actually help us deliver the services we and our clients need. Lessons learned. Yes, remember what's happened in the past, but don't let that actually be the driver. That's something to consider. Yes, that happened in the past. It won't happen in the future. One of the things that organizations have either are very good at, or they're very poor at, is effective communications. You have internal and external clients who need to know and understand what information you're going to share, who need to understand where you're heading, how you're heading. That internal communications will help calm situations and help give people that confidence that you're in control. Equally, external communications for your external customers really shows and highlights that you've got a grip of this, you can still deliver, you are a viable partner. Effective communications really do enable and do demonstrate robustness. It gives that confidence from third parties. Something that's often forgotten is organizational resilience. When we talk about organizational resilience, is we've gone through a crisis. Individuals have gone through trauma, might have lost loved ones, might be unable to visit family, might be unable to visit parents, might actually be unable to socialize as they used to. The mental and the welfare and mental well-being of your staff, of individuals within the organization, should really be a consideration. That also means what you're going to ask them to do in the future. You know, if somebody has an elderly parent who they can only see once a week, is it really appropriate to send them to China for 3 weeks? You know, what happens if something occurred during that time? Managers are dealing with the crisis. They are under immense pressure. Once the crisis is over, people say, okay, let's get on with everything. The mental harm that crisis and the mental strain that crisis could have put onto the manager needs to be addressed. Across the workforce, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be considered, because if your staff are fit and healthy physically and mentally, the likelihood of them actually going off sick, being inattentive, or failing to deliver is reduced. 3 factors that actually enable that resilience and robustness. By considering these and many other things, and there's no magic wand to say what you should consider, but by considering, the more you consider, the more you can identify potential pitfalls. The more pitfalls you can fill in and reduce the damage caused by them pitfalls, the greater the likelihood that them little shoots of recovery are going to actually increase and reduce increased organisation stability, whether that be through finance or that just be through clients. The final section that I'd like to talk about is continuous review during the recovery stages. We are still in the recovery stages. We are still in the crisis stages. So yes, be aware of what's happened in the past. You know, what's the dangers? What dangers did we have in the previously? But also be mindful of taking that step into the future. What risks exist in the future? It's a fine balance, you know. But if we continue to review the risks that exist, our organizational exposure to risks, then what we can do is make sure that actually we reduce and manage them to acceptable levels, which don't hopefully result in closure, redundancies, and impact on organizational effectiveness. Mindful of the time, just to summarize, COVID has had a global impact. It will continue to have a global impact. Many organizations are suffering and will continue to suffer because of organizations. Some organizations and some companies will go to the wall. All organizations can actually take a proactive step about where they are and how to manage and reduce the risks that are posed by the threats that exist. All organizations and senior management teams can future gaze. Where do they want to be? How do they want to get there? All organizations can increase their likelihood of survival if they proactively manage risks, grasp opportunities that present themselves. Professional help and advice is available to support organizations. You've got the Darlington Council, you've got the Tees Valley Combined Authority, you've got government, you've got Department of Trade, and you have professional services. Nobody, I think, can manage COVID in isolation. We do need to work together. The more we can work together, the greater the likelihood that Darlington and businesses in Darlington will succeed in the future.